Good morning, 8th graders. Today is April 14th, 2020. I believe it's day 21 of our homeschool quarantine school. Keep up the good work. Keep working on getting your assignments done on time, and please watch my videos. They're amazing. Today's objectives are to talk about the impact of the railroads. We talked yesterday on Monday about the building or the construction of the first transcontinental railroad and its purpose and its goal and who built it and how much money they made. Now, what difference does it make to us? Um, One big difference in particular. And then a couple of new gold rushes. So California is not the only gold rush in our history. So we're going to talk about a couple of other rushes or mass migrations of massive amounts of men and a few women to gold-rich territories across the country and where they were and how much money was involved and so forth. Please remember, check your grades. If something's not right, then email me your block and the color so that I can double check. Or if you finish a test, please let me know and I'll take care of it. I'll do those grades once a day. So if you email me in the afternoon, I probably won't do it till the morning of the next day. So that's the plan for today. So moving back into railroads, one of the biggest impacts was standardizing of time. So we have time zones. We live in the central time zone. If we go to the East Coast, they're the Eastern time zone. So right now, if it's 9 o'clock in the morning in the central time zone, it's 10 o'clock in New York City. Or if we head just a little ways, about 2/3 of the way, just out west of North Platte, Nebraska, we'll enter the mountain time zone, which is an hour earlier than it is here. We go a little bit further toward the coast on the western coast, and it's 2 hours earlier than it is here on the Pacific time zone. So there are four major time zones that cross the continental United States, um, standardized because of railroad time. Because the sun has already set in parts of the country at the same time as the sun is still visible and bright in other parts of the country. So it makes things more efficient. It replaces solar time, and in fact, it changes the concept of time. For instance, it, before the railroad, if I'm a farmer on the plains in Nebraska, I have a homestead in Nebraska, and it doesn't matter what time it is. Uh, it matters when lunch is ready and when dinner is ready and when the bell rings and I come in and eat. But it doesn't matter what time it is. But when the railroad comes through and all of a sudden I'm expecting a package or I'm a passenger on a train to head off somewhere, and the train schedule says they're leaving at 9 o'clock in the morning on April 14th, 2020, I better be at the station at 9 o'clock in the morning. So all of a sudden, time matters, and the railroad sets the time. It was most critical and important to them. You and I don't even think about that really because we don't set our watches. We look at our phone, and our phone automatically synchronizes to the correct time. Even when I was younger, or your parents were younger, maybe, depending on the age of your parents, there was a phone number you could call, and they would tell you exactly what time it was. So uh, no more solar time. You don't look up at the sun, or you don't listen to how your belly's growling and decide that it's lunchtime or noon. It also weakens the Native Americans. So one of the things that weakens the Native Americans that we'll talk about later on is the disappearance of the buffalo. So if railroads are super dependent on being on time to deliver their goods where and when they're supposed to be, goods and people, they better be on time. Well, there were gigantic herds of bison roaming the plains, just wild, millions of these animals, and there's no predators for a buffalo other than man and rifles. So if there's a herd of 10,000 buffaloes standing on the tracks and your train wants to go through, if the train tries to plow through the buffalo, it will derail the locomotive and it will not go where it's going. So they have to wait. And a herd of 10,000 bison could take hours to go through. So the railroad, for two reasons, begins to hire people to kill the buffalo. First, when the railroad was under construction, they hired hunters to kill buffalo to feed the builders. And second, they began to hire hunters to kill the buffalo to thin the herds so that it didn't slow down the trains. When they do that, it changes the food supply of the Native Americans. All of a sudden, huge quantities of food were not available to them that they were used to. The railroad, letter B there, acts as a lifeline to settlers. So if I have a homestead on the plains of Nebraska, I'm far away from everything. But I do have a catalog, and I could order stuff, and I could get mail. So, in fact, a lot of times the only two books that existed in homesteaders' homes were the Bible, which almost everybody owned a Bible, and a Sears and Roebuck catalog by the late 1800s and early 1900s. And you could order almost everything. Sears and Roebuck, Sears was sort of like the Walmart at the time. You could order a shotgun or a thread and needle or a butter churn or whatever you wanted, a new wagon from Sears. So when a farmer on the plains needed supplies or even needed to sell their crops or their supplies, they depended on the railroad. So and it connects the east and west for raw materials, things that exist in the west that they need in the east, easy to transport and trade. So the same reasons that they exist today. Here are the time zones. So you see here the eastern time zone is in the yellow. Nebraska is split, but we're in the central time zone. We are right here on the cursor. And if you head west, if you're going skiing in Colorado on vacation or something, you head into mountain time zone. All of a sudden, you're driving along the interstate and bam, it's an hour earlier. You're like, woo! But then when you come home and you're driving back this way and you're like, bam, it's an hour later. And that hour just disappeared just like that. So it's kind of weird and creepy and cool at the same time. Mountain time zone and then Pacific time zone. So I had a couple stories here about miners in particular, and we'll talk a little bit about ranching and cow hands and stockyards also. But in 1859, about 100,000 miners flocked to the area around what is called Pikes Peak in Colorado, near Denver, near Colorado Springs. Actually, gold was discovered in the area in 1858. This is a huge gold rush, 100,000 people in a year. By the spring of 1859, that many people have found out about it and come to the area. But the gold rush to California is going to last well over 30 years. That's why if you're a tourist in California, excuse me, I said California, I meant Colorado. If you're a tourist in Colorado, that's one of the things you'll do is you'll pan for gold, and you'll probably find a little bit, but not actually on Pikes Peak, but the area around it was densely gold rich, even more so than some of the claims in California. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll clarify a couple of other things when it comes to gold rush activity. But it's kind of an interesting thing. By the way, a few years earlier, an Army sergeant declared that Pikes Peak was unclimbable, which he was way wrong. You can actually see Pikes Peak from 130 miles away when the weather is good, which it's a tall peak, about 14,000 feet tall. And at one point, one very short extent of history, Pikes Peak was thought to be possibly one of the world's tallest mountains. So it is not, by the way. So here's a kind of a cool story. In 1858, this guy named John Gregory discovers gold near Pikes Peak, placer gold, which just means sitting on the surface, a lot like what Sutter and Marshall found at Sutter's Mill on the American River in California in 1848. It discovers gold at a place called Idaho Springs in Colorado near Pikes Peak. He tries to keep it a secret. We've talked about this one before, because if you don't keep it a secret, bam, 100,000 people are going to be there looking to take your gold. But the doofus went to town to buy supplies, and he paid for his supplies with gold dust. So now everybody knows it's there. By the spring of 1859, 100,000 people have flocked there. In fact, this overcrowding of people into this mountainous area of Colorado, beautiful area of Colorado, drew the attention of some nearby people. In fact, a newspaper editor from Nebraska City, in Nebraska, called this group of settlers, this 100,000 people, shiftless, lazy, lousy, scurvy, profane, insane, idiotic herd of rapscallion nincompoops and ninnies. Let me say that again. You can try this at home. A shiftless, lazy, lousy, scurvy, profane, insane, idiotic herd of rapscallion nincompoops and ninnies. What he didn't know is that the area around Idaho Springs and Cripple Creek and Victor, Colorado, over the next few years would produce over 500 mines and produce over 21 million ounces of gold. Just that area around Cripple Creek and Victor and Idaho Springs, 21 million ounces of gold. An ounce of gold today is worth about $1,600 ish, give or take a few $100 depending on the day or the week. So this is tremendous. In fact, that's more gold than was discovered in the California gold rush and subsequent gold rush to Alaska combined. So the gold rush to Colorado, I keep saying California, but Colorado was amazing. That's 1858, 1859. Still in 1890, another guy named Bob Womack discovers gold at a place called Cripple Creek in Colorado. This is kind of a sad story. This is probably what would happen to Mr. Bellamy if I were to discover gold, because that's just the way I roll. This Bob Womack discovers gold, and he's like, woohoo! But when you discover gold, you never quite know how big of a discovery it is. So he sells his claim for $300. $300. Eventually, $5 million worth of gold will be taken from his mine. So over that 30-year period or so, there were about 30 millionaires made from the gold rush, and lots of people making their fortune from the gold rush in Colorado. Now, I got some statistics here, some kind of interesting lessons. I don't know what all this stuff is on the side, but if you look, don't expect every prospect to turn into a winner. No whims, tips, fantasies, or wheeling and dealing, just good solid research and discipline. Number 2, don't be discouraged if your investment doesn't pay off right away. One prospector, his name was William Scott Stratton, took 15 years of digging to strike pay dirt. He finally found gold on the 4th of July in 1901 and called that claim the Independence. Eventually sold it for $11 million. So 15 years of hard work paid off with an $11 million claim. You don't have to be a miner and make a fortune in the metals. Horace Tabor wasn't a miner. In fact, his Colorado mine was jumped, which means somebody stole his mine from him. He opened a general store and made a heck of a lot of money that way. He staked 2 prospectors who, after years of work, found an enormous deposit, and Tabor sold his interest in that mine for $1 million. His biggest wealth came to putting his money to work. Lesson 4, don't sell too soon. This is the story of the guy that I talked about here. Even the initial guy, John Gregory, sold his claim too early and spent all of his time disappointed. I'll tell you another story of a guy that did the same thing here in just a minute. It's difficult to tell what time is best to sell. So mining is sort of a fun prospecting, speculating thing. Now here's one in Nevada, another gold/silver rush. A lode, by the way, is a deposit of a valuable mineral. So it could be silver or gold or platinum or uranium or almost anything on the periodic table of elements that has a lot of value. Those would be some of the main ones. But this is at a place in Nevada called the Comstock. It'll get the name Comstock Lode near Nevada City. Here's the thing. There's this guy named Henry Comstock. His nickname was Pancake. He didn't really have friends because people thought he was sort of a mooch, I guess. But they called him Pancake because they believed he was too lazy to bake bread, so he made pancakes instead. Now, I'm not sure what's wrong with that because I really do kind of like pancakes. But anyway, Henry Comstock was kind of a doofus. That's the way I read about him and describe him. And he didn't really know a whole lot about mining and speculating and researching. So he's hanging out, just doing his thing. And he had a couple of small claims. But his neighbors to his claim were a pair of brothers named Ethan and Hosea Grosh. In 1857, so close to the same time as the Colorado Gold Rush, this is happening in Nevada. So Ethan and Hosea strike it rich, but they don't really tell anyone. But Henry Comstock, being their neighbor, knows something is going on. So Hosea dies of sepsis. He gets an infection in his foot. It gets into his blood. Hosea is dead. His brother Ethan says to the neighbors, hey, I'm heading to California. What Ethan's actually doing is taking samples of ore to an assayer in California to determine the mineral content. He never comes back. He gets frostbite and freezes to death in the Rocky Mountains on the way to California. So Henry's like, wonder where they went. He takes their place, claims their claim. He goes through a trunk and he's looking at their samples and he doesn't even know what he's looking at. So Henry starts digging tunnels. I'm super simplifying this story here. It's a great story if you want to do some more research into it. but he's kind of digging through their mines, and it's ticking him off, and he's digging this mucky, really thick clay-like substance. It's sort of bluish in color, and it's getting in his way, and he's looking for the gold, and he's not finding it, and he can't figure out what these Grosh brothers were after, but he knows they were onto something big, until one day someone stops by Comstock's mine, and they're like, what are you doing? And what he's doing is he's dumping all this thick clay-like blue substance, which oftentimes, by the way, is mixed with gold, particles of gold, into the river. Well, that's stupid. What he didn't realize, he couldn't run it through a sluice box. We've talked about that technology before, because the clay-like substance would gum up the sluice box and all the gold would escape. What he didn't realize is all of that material that he was dumping was almost pure silver. So Henry Comstock was dumping silver. Now, silver's not worth near as much as gold. If an ounce of gold is about $1,600, an ounce of silver is about $16. But he was pulling silver out by the shovelful, not by the flake. So anyway, Henry Comstock ends up selling his shares of the Comstock lode for $11,000 and a mule. Takes off to go to, I think he goes to Idaho, and purchases some more, stakes some more claims. Anyway, he ends up dying poor, penniless and poor. So $11,000, by the way, would have been a significant amount of money back then. But when we look at what the Comstock lode does in a 20-year period between 1859 and 1880, it produces over $300 million in ore. Comstock screwed up. Would you rather have $11,000 and a mule or $300 million? Obviously, most of us, unless it's a really nice mule, would rather have $300 million. And the Comstock lode, by the way, the area near the Comstock lode is still rich in ore today, still producing. Some pictures of mining. You're in a cave mining by candlelight. No, thank you. Pictures of what development looks like, and you can see these mine shafts go into the sides of hills. Mark Twain, he actually visited the area, and he writes about the Comstock lode as a newspaper man. He says, the sidewalks swarmed with people. So great was the pack that buggies frequently had to wait half an hour for an opportunity to cross the principal street. Money was as plentiful as dust, and every individual considered himself wealthy. Yeah, right. Moving on to the cattle industry, an invention of barbed wire. There's a whole bunch of people that patented barbed wire. That's why there's thousands of different types. You can see it's usually just a piece of wire twisted around something pokey or sharp, and you can see there's lots of different ones in the picture here. Anyway, prior to the invent of barbed wire, cattlemen would drive huge herds of cattle from Texas north to railway stations, like in Nebraska. Mostly in Kansas, for instance, but railroads were expanding into the West and hauling cattle. You couldn't necessarily, even in the 1800s, butcher cattle where the cattle were and ship them because there weren't refrigerated rail cars. So you had to take the cattle to where they could be butchered and consumed. Barbed wire actually was invented and patented not to keep cows in, like we use it for today, but to keep cows out. So as territory on the plains in Kansas and Nebraska was actually settled in the Homestead Act, which is coming in later this week, farmers were planting crops, and then here comes the cattle drives, and what do cattle do when they walk through a field of corn? They destroy it. So farmers and cattlemen didn't care for each other very much, so farmers began putting up barbed wire fences to keep animals out of their fields, which ticked off the drovers or the cattle drives, and they started to snip the barbed wire fences, and it created quite a bit of friction between them. Again, some more different types of barbed wire. Lots of people collect this stuff. I don't really understand collecting barbed wire, but I guess whatever turns your crank. Here's some of the cattle trails. Here's the thing. Northern Mexico all the way through Texas, and we talked about this a little bit with the settlement of Texas. Yeah, free cows. You know, when the Spanish were settling in Mexico, they brought with them cattle, and the herds just kind of escaped and grew. And so besides raising your own cattle, there were still some places in the mid-1800s where you could find large cattle herds. Get the cows, take them all the way north on the Chisholm Trail, for instance, to Abilene, Kansas, put them on the train, You could ship them all the way back to wherever you wanted. Even here, the Western Trail goes to Ogallala, Nebraska, so and take the Union Pacific Transcontinental Line. Railroads lead to meat packing, which is an Omaha thing. Population growth because of gold and silver, or workers needed in the meat packing plants. Cities begin to grow rapidly. Omaha sort of gets its roots here. And here's where Omaha kind of gets its start: is stockyards. Started in Omaha in 1884 and don't close until 1999, so just not that long ago, 21 years ago. Um, Omaha passed Chicago in production of cattle in 1955. There were 7.7 million head of cattle in 1944 during World War II, 300 to 400 people working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By 1950, $2.5 million per day, $18 million in today's money was going through the stockyards and purchasing them and selling them. Here's where the stockyards are located if you're any good with Omaha. This is Highway 75 going into Omaha, so this is the one that goes through Fort Calhoun. Take it straight through. If you stay on Highway 75 and you go past Interstate 80, the stockyards are located right here. There's very little left of it today. I'll show you a picture of what's left today. This is what it looked like then. So all these huge cattle pens full of cattle. So if you were a cattleman, you ship your cows into Omaha, and then buyers from several dozen meatpacking plants would purchase pens of cattle. By 1910, the Omaha stockyards was buying 20,000 cattle a day. This is about all that's left. If you drive through South Omaha down Highway 75, you see the cattle exchange building here off to the west side of the Highway 75. So that still exists. But all of the feed pens are gone. Omaha used to just be a stinky town full of stink and flies and grossness. This is the building, a livestock exchange building. That's what it's called. And today, over 20% of America's beef is processed, meaning butchered and cut up and made into meat in Nebraska. So in 1957, only 50, 60 years ago, half the jobs in Omaha were stockyard-related jobs. So you either made your money buying and selling cattle, or raising the cattle, or slaughtering the cattle. Omaha was a cattle city. Which brings us to our discussion for the next day. So lots of interesting things about Omaha and the stockyards. Lots of interesting things about the gold rush and reasons for population growth and expansion, which leads to unfortunate things when the population of the white man grows on the plains. The population of the Native Americans seems to struggle a little bit, which will take us into Wednesday's discussion. You guys have a great day. See if you can get something out of that gold rush information and the stockyards information, a little local history with Omaha. Have a great Tuesday. Stay healthy. Stay well. Miss you guys. See you when I